Welcome to Evil Unmasked, where the shadows of history reveal their darkest secrets. I'm your host, Sierra Elizabeth. As a criminal justice and criminology graduate, I've always been drawn to the mysteries that lurk beneath the surface of everyday life. This podcast is dedicated to uncovering and discussing the truth behind some of the most chilling and intriguing cases in true crime history. In each episode, we'll deep dive into a different case, exploring the evidence, unraveling the clues, and bringing you the stories of the victims in the relentless pursuit of justice. From infamous serial killers to unsolved mysteries, no case is too complex or too obscure for me to tackle. In this episode, we'll be exploring the harrowing story of John List, an ordinary man whose extraordinary crimes and elaborate escape plan captivated the world. From his cold-blooded murders to his eventual capture, this episode is a gripping journey through a life marked by deception and tragedy. Buckle up as we delve into the chilling details and uncover the truth behind this notorious fugitive. This is Evil Unmasked. Let's begin. John Frederick List and Anna Marie enjoyed a relatively happy life together until tragedy struck with Anna Marie's cancer diagnosis. To provide the necessary care, John hired a live-in nurse named Alma. Despite their efforts, Anna Marie sadly passed away in 1923. Remarkably, just a year later, John married Alma, the nurse who had been by their side during those difficult times. Alma and John welcomed their son, John Emil List, on September 17, 1925, in Bay City, Michigan. At the time of his birth, John Frederick List was 64 years old and Alma was 38. Though it might seem confusing, it was a long-standing List family tradition to name their sons John. John's father worked tirelessly to provide for his family, eventually saving enough money to purchase 50 acres of farmland and start his own dry goods business. Meanwhile, Alma was overly protective of John, forbidding him from playing outside for fear of him getting sick or dirty. Unlike other boys his age, John wasn't allowed to participate in typical childhood activities. Instead, he spent his time sitting in the kitchen reading. Due to his mother's paranoia, John came to see the outside world as a frightening and dangerous place. John's freedom truly began when he started high school, breaking free from the constraints of his strict Lutheran upbringing. Enrolled in a public high school far from his home, he had to navigate a daily bus ride to get there. During his high school years, Europe was embroiled in conflict, and the attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan on December 7, 1941, thrust the United States into World War II. John was just 16, and his mother adamantly refused to let him leave school to enlist. His patriotic fever never waned. The day he graduated, he eagerly joined the Army as an infantry laboratory technician, ready to serve his country. John underwent basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, where he developed a deep appreciation for the discipline. During his training, he faced a personal tragedy. His father fell gravely ill and passed away on August 30th, 1944. Given compassionate leave to attend the funeral, John's stoic demeanor and apparent detachment puzzled those around him, despite the profound loss he had just experienced. After the funeral, he returned to his duties with renewed focus and was subsequently deployed to Europe in February 1945 to confront the Nazis on the battlefield. Upon his return, John enjoyed telling people tales of his wartime experiences, claiming he had been captured by the Germans, but cleverly used his impressive German skills, thanks to his family's deep German heritage, to win their trust. He even fabricated a story about earning a Bronze Star for his time as a prisoner of war, a claim that was entirely false. When John arrived home on April 22, 1946, he shared a variety of embellished stories but was notably vague about the specifics of his overseas service. Despite spending less than a year abroad, most of which was spent traveling, he claimed to have endured severe trauma, suggesting that he had a form of PTSD. Upon returning to Michigan, John enrolled at the University of Michigan, where he embarked on a journey to earn a degree in business administration. After successfully graduating with his bachelor's degree, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army Reserves. Fueled by ambition, John then entered an accelerated master's program, leveraging some of his military experience for academic credit. Just 3 months later, he achieved his master's in accounting, marking another significant milestone in his educational and professional journey. John would then get a job at a prestigious accounting firm in Detroit, Michigan. In 1951, Helen Taylor was deep in mourning for her husband, Marvin, who had been killed in action in Korea. After a long, painful wait of 6 months, she finally received his body and attended his funeral in Newport News, Virginia. Amidst her grief, her sister Jean gently suggested that bowling might provide a brief escape from the sorrow. That very night, a friend of John's also proposed a bowling outing in town. That night, Helen, still mourning the loss of her husband, would cross paths with John, an awkward and reserved man. When John introduced himself as lieutenant, Helen found it peculiar and out of place given their non-military setting. Her attention was drawn instead to John's more personable friend, who appeared warm and engaging. Despite their initial connection, the date took a disheartening turn when Helen discovered that he was married. And guess who was there to comfort her after she had discovered the disturbing news? John. John insisted he had no knowledge of his friend's marriage, assuring Helen that a good person like him would never condone deceiving a woman. Moved by his honesty, Helen chose to give the awkward John a chance. As their relationship grew, John's genuine attentiveness became evident. He listened as Helen shared stories of her youth, her early marriage to Marvin at just 15, and the birth of their first child, Brenda, just a year later. Helen gradually opened up about the more tragic aspects of her marriage. She recounted the profound sorrow of losing her infant son, Kenneth, who passed away at just 6 months, followed by the heartbreak of 2 stillbirths. As she shared these painful experiences, John felt a deep urge to protect and support her. In 1951, Helen revealed that she was pregnant, prompting the couple to decide on marriage. She converted from Methodist to Lutheran, and they married on December 1st. However, shortly after their wedding, Helen confessed to John that she had been mistaken about her pregnancy. Some speculated that she might have fabricated the story to secure the marriage, as Helen had little experience beyond married life. Her daughter, Brenda, believed that her mother had settled for John out of a desperate longing to be married once more. After a brief stint in San Francisco, where John worked as an accountant, processing paperwork for soldiers returning from Korea, he, Helen, and Helen's daughter Brenda relocated to Detroit. John was eager to embark on his new non-military career with a fresh accounting position. During this period, Helen endured 2 more miscarriages before finally welcoming their first child, Patricia, on January 8, 1955. Despite this joy, Helen was reluctant to have another baby. John, however, was adamantly opposed to contraception, believing instead in prayer and leaving their family planning in God's hands. In 1956, Helen became pregnant again, and this time she was obviously distraught. She confided in her sister Jean, expressing her fear that she might not survive another pregnancy. To help lift her spirits, Helen often indulged in shopping sprees, spending more money than John earned. John, not particularly good at managing finances, sought a higher-paying job. In 1956, he secured a position at an accounting firm in Michigan, earning an annual salary of $7,000. Significantly higher than the national average household income of $4,800. Despite the positive development, the family had to relocate to Kalamazoo. This move pleased Helen, as it meant distancing themselves from Bay City, where Alma, John's mother, resided. Alma disapproved of Helen and made her feelings abundantly clear. Once again, Helen became pregnant, and her doctor advised her to stay in bed as much as possible due to her history of miscarriages. Helen didn't mind this restriction and ended up joining 3 different book clubs, spending her days reading in bed. Her first child, Brenda, took on the responsibility of caring for Patty during the day until John returned home from work. It was evident that Helen was struggling, and her doctor recommended that she see a psychiatrist for signs of mental illness and depression. Instead, John suggested seeking help from the church and speaking with his pastor. Unfortunately, divine intervention won't resolve mental health issues. John Frederick was born on October 21, 1956. Although Helen was initially opposed to the name, she relented after John, with a frightening look in his eyes, yelled at her and insisted that it was a family tradition. About a year later, Helen became pregnant again and was once more ordered to stay in bed. Frederick Michael was born on August 26, 1958. Finally recognizing the severity of her struggles, John agreed she should see a psychiatrist who prescribed her a sedative called Doridin. John finally managed to purchase a house for the family, located on a street named Lover's Lane. It was during their time there that John began exhibiting obsessive-compulsive behaviors. He meticulously cataloged every penny spent and every seed planted, and he would trim the edges of the grass by hand. John struggled constantly to maintain a sense of perfection in a home he felt was full of imperfect people. Around this time, he received a promotion at the Sutherland Paper Company, becoming a manager and earning $9,300 a year. Despite the positive developments in his work life, John faced increasing challenges at home. Helen began leaving messages for him at work, saying things like, quote, "The baby soiled his diaper. If you want it changed, you have to come home and do it yourself," end quote. It was evident that Helen's mental health continued to decline, affecting the entire household. In 1959, Brenda ran away to Indiana to elope with her boyfriend. However, after they were involved in a car accident, the hospital contacted her parents. Helen and John gave them a lecture, but it had little impact. As soon as Brenda turned 18, she got married and left home. In 1960, the Sutherland Paper Company was acquired by Kalamazoo Vegetable Parchment, resulting in an overstaffed accounting department. Due to John's abrasive personality and obsessive-compulsive behaviors, he was advised to seek employment elsewhere. Taking this advice, John secured a position in 1961 as the general supervisor of accounting for a small company called Xerox Corporation, where he would earn an annual salary of $12,000. Although this was great news for John, the family had to relocate to Rochester, New York, where they were able to rent a spacious house. Initially, Helen was unhappy about the move. However, once in New York, she managed to stop drinking and reduce her use of sedatives. John and Helen even hired a babysitter occasionally so that they could go out together. Helen convinced John to get a vasectomy, alleviating her worries about having more children. In 1964, John was earning an impressive $25,000 a year at Xerox. However, the family was still falling into debt due to their extravagant spending on new furniture and appliances. Additionally, John insisted that Helen accompany him to corporate events, which eventually led to her to start drinking again. To manage their excessive spending, John sought a promotion, believing he was vice president material. Despite his confidence, the company noticed his shortcomings as a leader. John struggled with public speaking, often breaking out in hives and twitching nervously, which hindered his chances for advancement. Undeterred, John marched into his boss's office and demanded a promotion, but his request was denied. Undaunted, he threatened to quit if his demands were not met, prompting him to begin yet another job search. Fortunately, John's persistence paid off when he landed his dream job. He traveled to New Jersey to interview for the position of vice president and comptroller at First National Bank of New Jersey. The role came with a guaranteed salary of $25,000 and, most importantly to John, the coveted title of vice president. With his impressive new salary, John was able to purchase an estate named Breeze Knolls at 431 Hillside Avenue in Westfield, New Jersey. The estate had 19 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms, 10 fireplaces, and a ballroom equipped with a stained glass skylight. He finally had achieved his dream of showcasing his success to the world, albeit with a down payment borrowed from his mother. Alma was more than willing to lend $10,000, provided she could move in with them permanently. Helen, predictably, was infuriated by the prospect of living with Alma, whom she disliked intensely. To avoid Helen's understanding, John and Alma spoke in German, only to reveal later that Alma had already paid the deposit and sold her own house. During a heated argument about their new living arrangements, Helen fainted. John immediately promised to take her to a doctor as soon as they reached Westfield. Helen, however, insisted she already knew the cause of her illness. She claimed she had malaria, attributing it to her late husband, Marvin, who had been unfaithful during his military service. In 1948, he had given her syphilis, and at that time, doctors would deliberately induce malaria in hopes that the fever would eradicate the syphilis. Helen would later be diagnosed with cerebral atrophy, a condition characterized by the degenerative shrinkage of brain tissue. To manage her symptoms, Helen continued to use drugs and alcohol, which only worsened her condition, leading to increased disorientation and paranoia. The 1960s proved challenging for John as well, who struggled with the era's rapid changes. As a devout Lutheran, he found it difficult to adapt to the evolving social landscape where long-haired boys, widespread drug use, and anti-Vietnam War protests were common, contrasting sharply with his own values and expectations. Additionally, John's stepdaughter Patty was becoming increasingly outgoing and independent. One day, John received a call from her school after Patty had told her teacher to, quote, "go fuck himself," end quote. Around the same time, Helen decided that she no longer wanted to be involved with their local church. John's dream job was short-lived, lasting only a year before he was dismissed for failing to meet the responsibilities of vice president. His position required him to secure new business accounts for the bank, which involved reaching out to potential clients and persuading them to do business with First National. This demanded social skills that John lacked, ultimately leading to his termination. John was too ashamed to tell his family that he had been fired. Instead, he spent the next 6 months pretending to go to work while actually spending his days at the train station reading. To cover the family's expenses, John would withdraw money from his mother's bank account, which he had control over, convincing himself that it was merely a loan. He eventually secured a position at the American Photographic Company, which paid him only $12,000 annually. In an attempt to compensate for the shortfall, he took out 2 mortgages on their house. When the photo company relocated in 1961, John, of course, was unable to move with them. John found himself unemployed once again and was consumed by worry. Unable to provide for his family, he watched as Helen distanced herself from the church, and Patty seemed to be following suit. John was particularly distressed by Patty's participation in church-hosted dances, which he disapproved of. In response to their financial strain, he took a job working from home, selling insurance and mutual funds, a role that required social interaction, something John obviously struggled with. His lack of success in his new job, combined with the family's extravagant lifestyle, led to mounting bills and increasing financial pressure. By the end of the 1960s, Helen was hospitalized due to severe memory and balance issues. After conducting several tests, doctors suspected her condition might be linked to either brain syphilis or drug toxicity. Early signs of kidney disease pointed toward the latter. Helen had been consuming 5 or 6 scotches and 4 to 5 Doridans daily, in addition to dealing with the lingering effects of syphilis from the 1940s, which the malaria treatment hadn't fully eradicated. Consequently, she was now in the advanced stages of tertiary syphilis affecting her brain, and unfortunately, there was no treatment available to alleviate her condition. On a brighter note, John Jr. and Fred were growing up relatively untroubled. John Jr. was outgoing and passionate about sports, particularly soccer. In contrast, Fred was more reserved and preferred solitude, finding comfort in caring for the household animals. By 1971, John's income had dwindled to virtually nothing. Despite Patty and Fred taking after-school jobs to contribute, the mounting debts were overwhelming, and the bank was initiating foreclosure on their home. With his mother's bank account nearly depleted, John had no viable escape from their financial crisis. John began to resent his family, viewing them as parasites, draining his dwindling income. He believed his children were growing up in a godless world and feared their lack of faith would lead to their downfall. On October 14, 1971, John visited the Westfield Police Department to apply for a gun permit. After taking his fingerprints and instructing him to return in 2 weeks, the officer never saw him again. John realized that he had already possessed the firearms that he needed. During World War II, he had purchased a 1912 Steyr 9mm handgun and also owned his father's Colt .22 caliber revolver, both of which were stored in the family's basement. On November 5, 1971, John gathered his children at the kitchen table and gravely informed them that they needed to prepare for their impending deaths. He asked them whether they would prefer to be cremated or buried. Despite their shock, all of them chose burial. That evening, Patty attended her drama rehearsal, visibly distressed. Her drama teacher, Edward Liliana, noticed her distress and inquired about it. Patty tearfully replied, quote, "My father is going to kill me," end quote. Assuming it was an overreaction, Edward dismissed her concerns, assuring her that her father was not serious and everything would be fine. Patty continued to plead with him, warning that if her father mentioned that they were going away, it would mean her end. Believing it to be a plea for attention, Edward offered her a ride home, brushing off her fears. On November 9, 1971, John planned out every detail of the day. He started by calling the New York Times to cancel his newspaper delivery, only to settle down and read that day's edition. The front page headline, "School Prayers Blocked by House by 28 Vote Margin," only deepened his conviction that society was drifting away from its moral foundations. Flipping through the pages, he encountered ads promoting books about Charles Manson, provocative topics on sex, and other subjects he deemed corrupt. To John, it was a stark reminder that the world was spiraling into dangerous territory. After his 3 children had left for school, he retreated to his office and collected his 2 guns. Meanwhile, Helen made her way downstairs to prepare a cup of coffee. Dressed in her robe, she settled at the kitchen table, drinking her coffee. Helen had no idea that John had silently approached her. John walked up behind her and shot her in the back of the head with his 9mm. The bullet entered the base of her skull, lacerated her brainstem, and killed her instantly. John worried that his mother might have heard the incident, so he cautiously entered her quarters of the house. Alma, who was in the kitchen, turned around as John walked in. He fired a shot at her, but missed. Alma screamed, quote, "Are you crazy?" End quote. This time, John moved closer and fired again. The bullet penetrated her skull and lodged in her brain, causing her death. She was 85 years old. John had initially planned to move his mother's body downstairs, but quickly realized that he couldn't manage it. Instead, he dragged her body to a storage closet and then cleaned up her blood. After cleaning up as much as he could, John went to the basement and grabbed 3 sleeping bags. He laid them out on the ballroom floor before dragging Helen's body from the kitchen to the ballroom, placing her on one of the sleeping bags. He mopped up the blood again, unable to stand the sight of the mess. Finally, he took off his bloody clothes and took a shower. Putting on a fresh suit, John called his boss at State Mutual Life Insurance Company to cancel their scheduled meeting. He then contacted his pastor, explaining that the whole family would be out of town for a while due to Helen's mother falling ill. John also wrote notes for the children's schools to explain their absences. Around 1:30 p.m., he went to the bank and withdrew the entire $2,000 from his account and safety deposit box. He considered emptying his mother's account, but decided it wasn't worth the effort due to its low balance. His next stop was the post office, where he mailed a key to his mansion so that the police could access his desk, and asked the postmistress to hold their mail until the family returned. Once back home, John wrote letters to family members, including Helen's sister and mother, as well as Alma's sister. As he was writing, the phone rang. It was his daughter Patty, calling to say that she didn't feel well and wanted to be picked up. Frustrated, John agreed and went to go get her. They arrived back home, and John quickly parked the car, rushing inside before Patty. When she entered a few moments later, John shot her in the back of the head with his 9mm. Patty turned slightly at the last second, causing the bullet to pass through her left cheek, hit her foramen magnum, the hole at the base of the skull that the spinal cord passes through, and ricochet off her temporal bone. It would then exit through the left side of her face. She was 16 years old. He dragged her body into the ballroom and placed her on the sleeping bag next to her mother. Once again, he cleaned up the blood and then waited. At 5 p.m., John picked up Fred from work as soon as his shift ended. They drove back home together, but as soon as they arrived, Fred hurried inside, suddenly remembering that he had forgotten to feed the fish. Fred, the shy one known for caring for the household pets, was momentarily distracted. Seizing the opportunity, John followed him in, and while Fred's back was turned, he raised his weapon and shot Fred in the back of the head. He was 13 years old. John then dragged Fred's lifeless body onto the sleeping bag beside Helen and once again tried to erase the traces of his crime. John Jr., the last List child, was supposed to be at soccer practice that evening. However, due to cold weather, practice was canceled, a fact unknown to his father. Hearing a car pull up the driveway before he had time to reload his gun, John hid behind the kitchen door and waited. When John Jr. entered the kitchen, he was confronted by his father pointing a gun at him. John fired, but his son had already started running, and the bullet struck him in the back. John fired again, hitting the boy in the side of the head, but John Jr. was still alive. Desperately, John Jr. tried to crawl away but rolled onto his back to face his father. John shot his son between the eyes, but the boy's eyes still fluttered, fighting for life. Enraged, John emptied his gun into his son's chest until it was out of bullets. He then grabbed his revolver and continued firing until that too was empty. John Jr. had been shot 10 times. He was just 15 years old. Just like the rest of the family, John moved his son's body to the ballroom and attempted to clean up the blood. This proved to be a difficult task due to John Jr.'s struggle. After cleaning as much as he could, John resumed writing letters to his family and Reverend Ray Winkle, explaining why he had killed his entire family. John thought that, by confessing to your sins, they would be absolved. Once he was done confessing to his sins on paper, he believed that he was no longer to blame for his actions. His confession was 5 pages long, trying to justify his actions. Quote, "I am very sorry to add this additional burden to your work. I know that what I have done is wrong from all that I have been taught, and that any reason that I might give will not make it right. But you are the one person I know that, while not condoning this, will at least partially understand why I felt I had to do this. 1. I wasn't earning enough to support us. Everything I tried seemed to fall to pieces. True, we could have gone bankrupt and maybe gone on welfare. But that brings me to my next point. 2. Knowing the type of location that one would have to live in, plus the environment for the children, and the effect on them knowing that they were on welfare was much more than I thought they could or should endure. I know that they're willing to cut back, but this involved a lot more than that. 3. With Pat being so determined to get into acting, I was also fearful as to what this would do to her, continuing to be a Christian. I'm sure it wouldn't have helped. 4. With Helen not going to church, I knew that this would harm the children eventually in their attendance. I continued to hope that she would continue to come to church soon, but when I mentioned to her that Mr. Jersey wanted to pay her an elder call, she just blew up and stated that she wanted her name taken off the church rolls. Again, this could only have given adverse results to the children's continued attendance, so that is the sum of it. If any of these had been the condition, we might have pulled through, but this was all too much. At least I'm certain that they have all gone to heaven now. If things had gone on, who knows what would have been the case." End quote. John killed his entire family to ensure that they would go to heaven. In his letters, he explained that he had killed his mother to spare her the pain of the murders and to secure her place in heaven as well. He wrote about final arrangements and requested to be removed from the church and its rolls. After placing the letters in the filing cabinet, he wrote a note asking the pastor to deliver them. He then locked both guns and their remaining ammunition in the cabinet, placed the key in a drawer, and locked that too. Finally, he went to his room and slept without any trouble. The following morning, John ate breakfast and gathered some personal belongings, including his Bible and a paper bag containing his bloody clothes. He turned down the thermostat in the house, got into his 1963 Chevy Impala, and drove away. Neighbors believed that the List family had gone out of town, leaving their lights on to deter robbers. However, when the lights started to flicker and go out, people began to worry and grew concerned. One concerned party was Edward, Patty's drama teacher. He recalled a conversation with her where she had mentioned her father's threats to kill her, and that if he ever said they were going away for a while, it would be the end. Patty's friends also began to worry because they hadn't heard from her. Known for her love of writing letters and sending postcards, even on short trips, her silence was unusual and alarming. Edward began to investigate, asking a friend, a local police officer, if there was any way to check on the house. Unfortunately, the officer said that, to their knowledge, no crime had been committed, so they had no reason to enter the home. Determined, Ed decided to investigate himself. On December 5th, he parked on the street and discreetly approached the house, aware that the neighbors were keeping an eye on it. Finding an unlocked basement window, he climbed inside. Upstairs, he discovered the bodies in the ballroom. He then exited through the back door and locked it behind him. Ed would then go home. Fearful of getting in trouble for breaking and entering, he hesitated to report his discovery. 2 days later, on December 7th, Edward overheard some of his male students discussing plans to break into the List home. He intervened, telling them that he would handle it himself, and accepted the offer from another teacher, Barbara Sheridan, to accompany him. Edward made a lot of noise as he drove up the driveway, slamming his car door and knocking hard on the front door. His goal was to alert the neighbors, prompting them to call the police, which they did. 2 police officers arrived, and Edward and Barbara explained their concern about the List family, noting that no one had heard from them in over a month. Officer Charles Holler and George Lesnick understood and decided to check on the house. After inspecting the perimeter, Officer Lesnick noticed an unlocked window leading to the dining room. Entering the house, they saw 4 large fish tanks, 2 filled with dead fish and 2 with automatic feeders, keeping the fish alive. Classical music played softly throughout the house via an intercom system. Noticing streaks on the floor that appeared to be blood, the officers followed them into the dark ballroom. Initially, they didn't see the bodies, but as they searched with their flashlights, they discovered what they first thought were mounds of clothes. Upon closer inspection, they realized that there were 4 bodies lying on the floor. The officers cleared the house room by room. In the master bedroom, they found bloodstains on the bed sheets, suggesting that the killer may have sat there at some point, as there wasn't enough blood to indicate a murder had occurred in that spot. In the kitchen, they found bloodstains that appeared to have been partially cleaned up. Opening a storage closet, they discovered the crumpled-up body of Alma List, lying in a heap with a towel over her face. Officer Holler called dispatch to report a mass murder. This news shocked Chief Moran, as the town hadn't experienced a murder in 8 years, let alone a mass killing. Upon his arrival, Chief Moran found a note on the desk that read, quote, "To the finder, 1. Please contact the proper authorities. 2. The key to this desk is in an envelope addressed to myself. 3. The keys to the files are in this desk." End quote. The mail for the house at 431 Hillside Avenue was still being held at the post office. There were a total of 162 pieces of mail waiting for the List family at the post office. Instead of sorting through each piece, authorities decided to pry the desk open. Inside the filing cabinet, they found firearms and an envelope addressed to the Reverend. In the letter, John explained why John Jr. had been hurt more than the rest of the family. Quote, John got hurt more because he seemed to struggle longer. The rest were immediately out of pain, but John probably didn't consciously feel anything either. End quote. He had crossed out the word probably. Did he truly believe that he could appear compassionate by claiming that he tried to end his family's lives quickly and without pain? The letter continued, quote, "Please remember me in your prayers. I will need them, whether or not the government does its duty as it sees. I am only concerned with making my peace with God, and for this I'm assured, because of Christ dying, even for me." End quote. On December 9th, 1971, John List Impala was found at Kennedy International Airport along with his car keys, school ID, alumni card, forestry card, and New Jersey State Board of Accounting cards. Authorities reviewed passenger records for flights over the past month, but found no trace of a John List. It was presumed that he had flown under a different identity. Given the lax security of the time, comparable to that of a library, it wouldn't have been very difficult for him to do so. Alternatively, John could have parked the car there to create the illusion of a flight while using another form of transportation to escape. The FBI joined the investigation, issuing a warrant for unlawful flight to avoid prosecution in addition to the 5 existing warrants for premeditated murder. Wanted posters featuring his description were plastered everywhere, warning that he was sought for killing multiple family members and should be considered dangerous. On December 9th, John List was added to the FBI's most wanted list, where he would remain for 13 years. After reviewing John's history, authorities discovered he frequently required adjustments to his glasses prescription and suffered from severe hemorrhoids, often purchasing Preparation H. Flyers detailing his condition were sent to eye doctors and pharmacies nationwide. Authorities scoured every state where John had family and reached out to international contacts for their search. They entered his fingerprints into databases and collected handwriting samples in hopes of tracking him down. On August 30th, 1972, a neighbor awoke around 3 a.m. to see that the List house was engulfed in flames. More than 100 people gathered outside, watching helplessly as the horror house burned uncontrollably. The blaze was too intense to be extinguished, and the home was beyond saving. Still, nobody knew where John was. A man named Robert P. Clark purchased a mobile home trailer in Denver, Colorado for $1,500 in cash. He spent his days reading newspapers, books, and Bibles, as well as watching TV. Living off his dwindling life savings, he eventually walked across the street to a Holiday Inn to apply for a cook position. Robert P. Clark was in fact, you guessed it, John List. John had driven his Impala to the long-term parking at the airport before heading to the train station. He traveled to Michigan and eventually arrived in Denver. He stayed at the Motel de Ville and ordered a new Social Security card. At that time, anyone under 50 could obtain a new card with no questions asked. He chose the name Robert Peter Clark after a student he had once known and changed his birthday to April 26, 1931, making himself 6 years younger. He fabricated names for his parents, and after some time, his new card arrived. He then purchased his trailer and secured a job at the Holiday Inn. It appeared that Robert couldn't entirely escape his past as John List. He was eventually fired from his job as a cook due to his lack of speed. Undeterred, he secured a new position as a cook at Piney County Country Club and moved into a furnished apartment 3 years after the murders. In 1975, he decided it was time for a fresh start and joined St. Paul's Lutheran Church. He also obtained a driver's license and bought a bright orange VW Bug. Additionally, he began attending singles events hosted by his church, attempting to build a new life. At these events, he met Dolores Miller, a woman in her mid-30s. Robert and Dolores dated for a significant period, during which he claimed his wife had died from cancer. Dolores appeared to be a positive influence on Robert, encouraging him to take courses at H&R Block to return to accounting. By 1977, he secured an accounting position at Roberto Distributing, earning $1,900 a month. He moved into a new apartment and, after 2 years, crafted a resume with fabricated past employers. This new resume would help him land a job at All Packaging Company. Around this time, Dolores and Robert purchased a condo in Montbello. Despite this, Robert continued to live in his own apartment, working on starting his own consulting business, while Dolores resided in the condo alone. On November 23, 1985, Robert and Dolores married and moved in together. During the move, a curious neighbor named Wanda asked about the commotion. She was taken aback to learn about Robert, as Dolores had never mentioned him before. Despite this seemingly positive time, Robert was fired for not being able to adjust the changes within the company when computers were introduced. Robert again had a hard time finding a job, and in 1987, the bank was threatening to foreclose on their condo, and Dolores was threatening to leave him. Desperate for a fresh start, Robert sent a letter to a job agency in Richmond, Virginia, and successfully landed a position. He moved to Richmond, with Dolores joining him later. Robert narrowly avoided discovery as the nosy neighbor, Wanda, nearly exposed him. Wanda had read about John List's horrific crimes and noticed that Robert bore a striking resemblance to the fugitive, including a matching scar behind his ear. She raised her concerns with Dolores, who dismissed them with a laugh, saying, quote, "How could you think this awful man was my Bob?" End quote. Wanda was convinced that it was just a coincidence and let the matter drop. Dolores resigned from her job and moved to Richmond with Robert. They found a comfortable house and purchased it, with Robert working at Madeira, Joyner, Kirkham, and Woody, while also taking on freelance projects. Dolores struggled to find employment and faced an additional setback when she was involved in a car accident, which required surgery on her finger. By the late 1980s, America's Most Wanted had captured the nation's attention, and it was one of Bob's favorite shows, which he rarely missed. On May 21, 1989, however, he was forced to skip the episode due to a company event. Coincidentally, this episode featured a segment of the John List murders. Wanda Flannery, along with her daughter Eva and son-in-law Randy, watched the episode. The show displayed photos of John List from before the murders and featured a bust of what he might look like now. Wanda, struck by the resemblance, exclaimed, quote, "There he is! That's Bob!" End quote. She pointed out the similarities, prompting Randy to call the hotline and provide Bob Clark's new address. On June 1, 1989, FBI agents knocked on the Clarks' door. Dolores was taken aback by their presence and was shown a wanted flyer featuring a man who closely resembled her husband. She exclaimed, quote, "That could be my husband," end quote. She then showed them a wedding photo, and one of the agents became confident that the man in the flyer was indeed her husband. Dolores informed the agents that Bob was at work, and they proceeded to his job. Upon locating him, Agent August asked, quote, "Are you John List?" End quote. Bob denied the accusation. The agent quickly restrained him up against a wall and pressed him with questions. "Do you have a mastoid scar? Have you had a hernia operation?" Bob's confirmations provided the evidence that they needed. They knew that they had their suspect. Bob was taken to the FBI office, where his fingerprints were entered into the database and confirmed the agent's suspicions by matching to those of John List. Despite the evidence, John maintained his innocence in court and remained emotionally distant throughout the proceedings. He eventually broke down when Helen's sister, Jean, embraced him and asked why he had committed the murders. John responded, "There was no other way. It just had to be that way." Even after 18 years, he still believed that he had saved his family and showed no remorse for his actions. On February 16, 1990, John's lawyer finally acknowledged his true identity following the confirmation of his fingerprints and family member testimony. The lawyer attempted to have John's confession letter excluded from evidence, arguing that it was privileged communication addressed to his pastor. This request was denied as the letter explicitly asked for the evidence to be sent to the appropriate authorities. In a final desperate measure, the lawyer tried to argue that John was insane at the time of the murders. However, a psychiatrist testified that John was, in fact, sane, calm, and composed during the crimes. On April 12, 1990, a jury found John List guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences. John died in prison on March 21, 2008, at the age of 82. Unclaimed by any family members, his body was cremated and his ashes buried in a state cemetery. Thank you for joining us on this chilling episode of Evil Unmasked. Today we dove into the haunting story of John List, a truly twisted individual. If you found this episode compelling, be sure to subscribe and leave a review to help others discover my podcast. For more updates and behind-the-scenes content, follow me on Instagram at evil.unmasked or on X at evil_unmasked. If you have any case suggestions or stories you would like to hear, please visit me at evilunmasked.com. Join us next time as we explore another gripping true crime tale. Until then, stay safe and keep questioning the world around you. This is Sierra Elizabeth, signing off.